And
Okay,
this is I'll just start to Miriam. I'm Doug Miller here in Montreal. I'm with Marion Pollock in Vancouver, I believe, and Jane Armstrong and Ken Lukart in Toronto. Miriam was an activist with the Canadian Union of Public Workers, of Postal Workers, in the 70s, I presume it was, and 80s. And so, Miriam, we sent you a consent form, and we'd ask you to acknowledge verbally here on online that that you've read it, you understand and agree.
I read it, I understand, and I agree, and I give consent.
Okay, thank you so much. So, Miriam, just
Firstly, it's Marion, M-A-R-I-O-N.
Marion.
Yeah.
Okay, Marion. I saw that and I didn't absorb it properly.
I called way worse, so don't worry.
Okay. Marion, I just wanted to ask you if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, a little bit about your background, where you come from and how you got involved both in union and what you understood maybe of apartheid and SACTU, how you got there in the beginning.
Okay. I became an employee at the post office in 1974. I was on afternoon shift. And 6 months after the day I completed probation is the day I became a shop steward. I was put in a union work area because I think that management thought I was slow, and they were very consciously trying to break the union in that work area. So they put me in because they thought I had limited intellectual capacity, and they and so they surprised me. I surprised them by becoming a steward the day after I got off probation. I was active in CUPW on a variety of levels from the day I started to 2012 when I retired, and now currently I assist people who are retiring with their pension paperwork. I do pension courses for the union and stuff like that, and I mentor some of the newer activists. What I remember about SACTU was firstly the toucans. That's what But what I remember is that SACTU was a broadly based trade union group in supporting workers in South Africa and fighting against apartheid. In hindsight, I would say, I mean, now, 40, 50 years later, I question whether or not there was a strong gender analysis coming from SACTU. But that's 50 years of hindsight, not time in the time in the present. I also at some point became a delegate to the Vancouver District Labour Council, and it was we were meeting every 2 weeks and it was there were a lot of leftists, a lot of people who were either members of or very influenced by the Communist Party, but they were primarily men. And I mean, they would take on the heavy issues, but none of the kind of gender issues. And then we had the CLC reps, who were there all the time. And every time we mentioned SACTU, they would intimate, we can't deal with them. They're communist. And that's what I remember really clearly. And I also remember that the more they raised it, the CLC rep said, we can't raise it. We were young, we were kind of unstrategic, and the more they raised it, the more they try to tell us not to raise it, we raised it.
Tremendous.
Well done.
And what were these were debates, or they were resolutions, or they were actions?
Resolutions mostly, because or reports, because you could give union reports. Yeah, they were just very reluctant for us to raise it.
Wow, that's amazing. Ken, did you have any other?
Yeah, just a couple of things. Since I did a lot of the work in BC, I do remember the importance of VDLC, Vancouver District Labour Council, supporting us, which meant that it wasn't just that organization, it was all of the affiliates to the Labour Council, which is how the CLC can bring people together. So it's a directly chartered institution of the CLC itself. And jumping right to the politics that Marion has gotten us into, which I think is great. It's definitely the case that the CLC had its reps all over the country advising local leaderships of labor councils to stay away from the Sector Solidarity Committee, because we had already proven ourselves capable of organizing better around South Africa than they could. That was the main reason, I think. And we were out fundraising from our own work with no paid staff, out fundraising the CLC. So every time we went to a labor council meeting, we were likely to run into a CLC rep who was telling the local affiliates to stay away from us. Yet when we made the presentation, the response was always very positive. And so then it was a matter of the politics of the Labour Council, what they wanted to do. But I can certainly say that the Vancouver District Labour Council was fully on side. Now, I don't think I spoke when you were president, Marion. I think it was before you became an officer. I remember Frank Kennedy.
Yes, I was never president. I was first vice, and I chaired meetings, but I was never president.
Okay. Well, I got that wrong.
Frank.
Frank Kennedy was the president when I was invited to speak, I think.
And Frank was a good, Wilson Longshore had good leftist politics.
That's right.
Around women, less so, but yeah, good leftist politics.
Yeah.
And he actually, and one of the things, actually, and this relates, one of the things that was always important and very much influenced the VDLC was that we're a port city. So we have, for ever since I remember going to Labour Council, we always had reports from the ITF inspectors, International Transport Federation inspectors, about conditions on ships and stuff that came to Vancouver. And what that did is it actually predisposed us to being much more in support of international solidarity from the VDLC and people like Frank, who came from Longshore, because we always got reports from the ITF inspectors about ships and stuff and how appalling those conditions were for workers on ships.
That's such an important point, because Jerry McCullough, who was the ITF rep in Vancouver that worked with Longshore, he's the person who arranged for us to get the data, the transcripts, and the manifests of all the South African ships that came into port.
I don't remember Jerry. I remember Dave Crane, Tommy McGrath.
Of course.
Peter LaHaye, and someone else in between, but yeah. But it was really, I think that was really critical to the VDLC being in support, was the long-standing relationship with the ITF.
Now, was it only South Africa where the CLC reps gave you problems, or was it on other issues like Nicaragua and other solidarity?
Nicaragua, CUPW. Women, like, we could go on and on, right?
Yeah, okay.
I remember, let's talk about this time, in 78, we went on strike, CUPW went on strike, and we defied legislation, and Dennis McDermott, then the CLC president, brutally attacked us verbally, you know. I mean, he called us dinosaurs, etc. The VDLC, you know, came out and supported us and things like that. But so the CLC reps on almost a lot of issues didn't like us. You know, pro-choice is, you know, was one of the other ones. You know, Sid Thompson was also involved, and Sid was from the IWA, which no longer exists now. And, you know, in retrospect, he was more progressive than a lot of the IWA workers were, and he certainly was incredibly well respected by his membership. But, oh, he was anti-choice, and we used to just get up and speak about choice and just see him to make him squirm.
So gender was quite a struggle then. I mean,
I think Jane could answer that even more, but in the early, yes, of course. The trade union movement was, you know, I mean, I still think it's a struggle now as is race, but the trade union movement was very white male when I started, and, you know, women weren't treated equally. And I mean, and that's why I've come to say that in retrospect, and it's only retrospect, you know, that, you know, SACTU talked, you know, about, you know, did not, you know, I learned about the conditions of workers in South Africa. I learned about the conditions of apartheid in South Africa, and I learned about how appalling it was. But we never talked about issues like gender or things like that. We talked about class and race. But this is retrospect, not, I didn't think that at the time.
I think that's fair comment.
and
Yeah.
I think it representative that you, as one of the women, and Jane for that matter, and Brenda and many others, were struggling to make that place for women in the movement.
Yes. Yeah.
I saw that the tribute page that they put together with you and others in it for the I can't remember what organization it was. Oh yeah, for CUPW. Yeah, Trailblazing Women of CUPW. You feature in there.
Yeah.
And that's that. I mean, it's a tribute to today that this kind of recognition is being acknowledged as a part of the
Right.
struggle of the labor movement.
Right. But I also think that one of the things that SACTU did was they talked about sort of reality. It wasn't just sort of politics. They talked about the reality of people's lives in South Africa. And that made it way easier for, you know, for postal workers, you know, to be able to understand what was going on. When you hear, you know, when you hear stories of workers, you know, who could be you, could be your friends, could be your neighbors existing in South Africa, rather than just sort of like, and I think that was one of the strengths of SACTU, rather than just talking about how appalling and how dangerous and how cruel and anti-worker apartheid was, or is. We also, you know, we also sort of learned about it from real people and real issues. And I thought that was really one of the strengths.
Did you ever meet any South Africans in this process?
Yes. I think Avert talked about, I haven't talked to him, but when I talked to him before about this, we had a big meeting with somebody from, in our local, CUPW Vancouver local, was somebody from South Africa. And it blew people's minds. I mean, it really did, because it was like, here's a real life person talking about their real life experiences. And I mean, and I actually think those kind of things really influenced me about how to do international solidarity, you know, on an ongoing basis. The real stories of real people are really critical.
Marion, we talked about that yesterday with Everett, and it was when that meeting, your local union meeting in Vancouver in 1981 on Richmond Street.
Richard
Street. That's where I met you. That's where I met Sherry Hillman. That's where I met Everett. We had Zola Zembe with us, who was a national officer of SAC2 based in London, in England.
Right.
He was on tour. He addressed the your local meeting that month. And that's
I thought Sherry was fired by then. I swear she was fired by then.
Okay.
Anyway, Jane, any comment?
Oh, I just can echo everything that Marion is raising around so many issues. We were fortunate, though. Phyllis Altman came from SACTU, from Southern Africa, to Canada. And as I recall, we took her to a few events, including the Port Elgin, at that time, UAW Education Center in the early 80s, to meet with leadership up there. And but we couldn't get her across the country, as I recall. I think she was pretty much in Ontario. But yes, what's that old slogan, Ken? When you've struck a woman, you've struck a stone.
A rock.
Yeah.
A rock. And the women in South Africa, those that we met, talked about the struggle within the movement. we had some intersection on that scale. But Laurel Ritchie, whom you'll remember well, we've done an interview with her. She has a T-shirt, Women Against Apartheid, that she's kept from those years. And she also raised, the same issue about women in the labor movement in general, but also in the context of the struggle in South Africa. And there were some similar statements about, sort of when you win the class struggle, we'll deal with women's issues after that.
But I think another point that needs to be added to this discussion, and Doug, I think you'll probably have something to say about this. Most of the exiled South Africans were men. And so our opportunity to bring Black South African trade union women to Canada was limited as compared with on the gender question. Not totally, we did have some opportunity, but it was very rare.
And I also think that it reflects the contradictions that some of us have always felt about international solidarity, which is, the issue is so important, and I feel, like 50 years later, I feel different, but the issue is so important. Do I want to go and sort of diminish the issue by talking about women? And I think it's I think it's always a contradiction in terms of how you go about international solidarity. And, I saw, the struggle against apartheid so critical that that it's hard to, in some ways, to say during the thick of it, and they're not good on women, or where are the women? Whereas now, 50 years later, it's easier to do in retrospect, and it's easier to do after 50 years of struggle around women. So, I just want to, I think it does reflect, though, some of the contradictions around doing international solidarity in general. And this is not a criticism, it's just like a learning for me.
Well, and it was very much the climate, social and cultural climate of the time, that those issues were fomenting, but they weren't on the top burners and the front burners. Today, now, when we deal with whatever issue it may be, Palestine, there are Palestinian women, Colombia, there are Colombian women, even internally, the movements that are activists are including women much better than they did in the past, and much more fully.
I would say during those times, women were organizing on those issues. They were on our front burners, but they weren't necessarily on the front burners of the leadership of the trade union movement, and even the left leadership of the trade union movement. I mean, I would go to Action Caucus meetings a lot. And, certainly, there was sort of sexism and discrimination, and not a willingness to take up on gender issues, but certainly, but I would also say that without the Action Caucus, we couldn't have got through many resolutions and many issues we did at the CLC. So, it's not like it's all nuanced.
Well, I probably articulated that wrong, but I meant exactly what you said there. It took the energy of powerful women and determined women like yourselves to push those forward, to make them front burner. Well, okay. Where to here? Ken, Jane?
I'm just wondering, Marion, if you remember at all the year 1986. At that point, we had called as the Sector Solidarity Committee for a week of action across the country in March. And I don't know whether you remember actions taken in Vancouver with the Vancouver District Labour Council, but also with CUPW. Does any of that ring a bell? And
yeah, I think I was partially working at the Vancouver local office then, not the full time, but in part. And yes, we talked. Jean-Claude Perrault talked about not sending mail to South Africa. I remember that really clearly. But it's sort of important, by not sending mail to South Africa, you de facto are, because if you sort it and you put it all in one pile, South Africa. You are, but I remember a lot of discussion on the floor, and unlike other international solidarity action, people knew that they were going, they could get in trouble with it, and they knew it was kind of impossible. But people supported it because they were so appalled by apartheid. And I think that the Longshore talked about, yeah, I remember that really pretty clearly. And also we weren't one at Vancouver, there's a couple of hubs that Mail for South Africa went out of. I don't think Vancouver was one of them, but I remember a fair amount of, while there was sort of reluctance because you knew you would get in trouble, and you knew that the employer would be really looking closely at the activists, who were sorting, there was still a lot of support for it because people understood the need for solidarity and the direness of the situation. And I think that the Longshore refused to load or unload ships, going to or coming from South Africa. And the VDLC was active in supporting that.
Right.
Thank you. Well, Marion, I really think you've provided some wonderful insights here, and I thank you.
Okay.
Do you also remember in 1986, the Canadian Labour Congress Convention, where Jay Naidu from CUPW spoke? Does that ring a bell at all? No. Okay.
No.
That's okay. We're all challenged. This is 35 years ago.
No, I remember. No, I don't.
No problem.
Yeah.
Well,
I remember hearing him speak, but I could not. I until you said it was at a CLC, I would not have remembered.
And can you talk about what kind of impact the anti-apartheid work within your union might have had on, I don't know whether CUPW established Black and Aboriginal caucuses, or whether the anti-apartheid work influenced anti-racism work going forward into the 90s. Do you have any recollection of that?
What I would say, well, firstly, when I became a member of CUPW, in our national constitution, we didn't have that many policies, and we didn't have that many policies on international solidarity. But the one policy, one of the few policies we had was on SACTU and supporting SACTU and opposing apartheid in South Africa. That I know for sure. I think in terms of that, in terms of the issue of people of color in the union, I think you'd have to talk more to them. But I do know that in 2008, at the 2008 convention, we passed a resolution supporting BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions for Israel as a result of their occupation of Palestine. And I think that could not have happened. I mean, that happened for a variety of reasons, including a fair amount of work done by people. But I also think that the history of the union supporting SACTU and opposing apartheid in South Africa was a critical backdrop to that, and critically informed that. The activists, my generation of activists had all either participated in some form or another with SACTU or knew about it, and therefore we were able sort of to talk about the problems with apartheid and the importance of solidarity.
Wow, that's great.
Wow, yes.
Can I use that opportunity, Marion, to let you know that you and I have been on a couple of conference calls around the question of labor committees within the Independent Jewish Voices, etc. I had a very productive 2-hour conversation last night with Labor for Palestine. They had approached me to want to find out more about the work of the SACTU committee. I had a very good discussion, and we were encouraging them to get together with the IJV trade union committee to put forward a common front in the labor movement. And I think there may be something coming from that.
And that's Hassan and Kelty mostly?
Yes.
Yeah. I work with both of them, yeah.
Yeah, also, what's his name? Aiden McDonald.
Oh, yeah. I know Aiden. His dad, John McDonald.
Yeah, he organized the call.
John?
No, Aiden did.
John McDonald for a long time worked for CUPW.
Okay.
He was one of the staffers responsible for what we would call our Appendix T projects.
Mhm.
When Aiden went to Israel and he got, they wouldn't let him out or wouldn't let him in, and I can't remember. And he lied through his teeth to get in. And I went to his dad, who was still working for CUPW, and I said, "You must be proud of how good your boy can lie." But he was waiting to do it because it was the only way he could do what he had to do, right? Yeah. But I actually think, I really do think, and I just need to emphasize that one of the reasons we passed that, the BDS resolution, which was historic, was because of the experience with South Africa and the experience, with SACTU, and yeah.
A tremendous insight. Thank you so much for that. Well, okay. Well, Marion, if you had any last comments before we...
No, I can go back to have my nap now. Jane, I thought you were on Vancouver Island, or did I just make that up?
I'm sorry?
Jane, I thought you were on Vancouver Island, or did I make that up?
You did not. I was there in Port Alberni for about 7 years.
Okay.
fighting a new coal mine called the Raven Coal Mine for
Right,
the majority of those years.
Right.
But I moved back a few years ago to Toronto. My son
Okay.
is here, and
yeah.
it's too many miles of,
And I mean, I like Port Alberni to visit, not to live.
you and quite a few others. I used to joke that I thought Trump could get elected there by about 51%. But they've been through a lot of tough times. And
Well, let me turn the recording off so we can socialize. Is that okay?
yes, good.
Marion, just on behalf of the Sac Solidarity Committee and the Canadian Anti-Apartheid Activist Project, I want to thank you very much for your
Okay.
contribution, and it was invaluable, I must say, and very insightful and helpful. Thank you so much. So I'm going to turn the
Okay.
recording off now, and then we can just yak away as long